Hello everyone, welcome back to ECO152. In this video we are doing chapter 5 of the module, which is all about measuring the performance of the economy. Moving right along to the objectives of this chapter, we are going to explain what the national accounts represent, define and calculate the unemployment rate, and also define and interpret the consumer price index, which is known as CPI in short, provide an explanation for the balance of payments, and also provide an explanation for a Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. This graph shows the GDP per capita for 5 centuries for 5 different countries. On the vertical axis, you have your GDP per capita, and then on the horizontal axis, you have the years, different years. And then the different shades of colors represents the different countries that are presented in this graph. As you can see that the country with the highest GDP per capita is Britain, and then the one with the lowest GDP per capita is India. The following graph shows South Africa's real GDP growth since 1946 to 2016. As you can see that South Africa's real GDP has been positive in most years, with the exception of the few years where the bars are pointing down. Also in 2009, South Africa's real GDP was negative, and this could be due to the fact that there was a global financial crisis. This graph shows South Africa's real GDP versus China's real GDP. South Africa's real GDP is represented by the green line, whereas China's real GDP is represented by the purple line. China is the world's second biggest economy, which is around 29 times of South Africa's economy. This is evidenced by the distance between the graph. As you can see that China's real GDP is way above South Africa's real GDP. And then this graph shows the real GDP growth for the Brics countries. Brics is the acronym coined to associate 5 major economies, which are known as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. As you can see on the graph that China's real GDP growth is still on the lead, which is followed by India's real GDP growth. This graph shows the real GDP growth for the world. Even in this case, China's real GDP growth is still on the lead, and it is even greater than United States' real GDP growth. Gross domestic product, which is known as GDP in short, it is defined as the total value of all final goods and services that are produced within the boundaries of a country in a particular period, which is usually 1 year. The elements of GDP are as follows. Value, meaning that they are expressed in monetary terms. Final goods and services, value added, that is the ultimate use by the consumer. And then the geographic aspects, meaning that they must be produced within the boundaries of a country. The current production, only new goods and services considered in a period, meaning that goods that were produced in the previous period are not considered. And then gross, that is no provision is made for depreciation. This picture shows an example of bread production. That is the different stages that the bread has to go through before it is sold at the shops. A detailed explanation is provided below. A farmer produces 1,000 bags of wheat, which he sells to the miller at 10 rands per bag, yielding a total of 10,000 rands. The miller processes the wheat to flour, which he then sells to the baker for 12,500 rands. The baker then uses the flour to bake the bread and sells the bread to the shop for 18,000 rands. The shop then sells the bread to the final consumer for 21,000 rands. The total value of the 4 transactions is equal to 10,000, plus the 12,500 rands plus 18,000 plus 21,000 rands, which is equivalent to 61,500 rands. Is this the value of production? No, there has been a double counting that has occurred. So in order to avoid double counting, we do two things. We simply have to take the value of the final good sold to the consumer, that is the bread sold by the shop, or we simply add the value added during each stage of production. So we take the value of sales by the shopkeeper, that is the 21,000 rand, or the value added in each stage of production, which is also equals to 21,000 rand. There are three methods of calculating GDP. The first one is the production method, which is also known as the value added. And then the second one is the expenditure method, which is the spending on final goods and services. And then the last one is the income method, that is the income of the factors of production. So this is how you calculate each of the three different methods. The expenditure method, you take the value of the final goods and services, of which in our example it was equivalent to the 21,000 sold to the consumers at the shop. In accordance to the production method, you take the value added at each production stage. So in our example, it was the 10,000 plus the 2,500 rands plus the 5,500 rands plus the 3,000 rands, which was also equivalent to 21,000. And then according to the income of factors of production, you take the primary input payments, that is the wages and salaries, rent, interest, and profit paid during the production process. That is the 10,000 rands plus the 2,500 rands plus the 5,500 rands plus the 3,000 rands, which is also equivalent to 21,000. GDP valuation at factor cost or income, basic prices and market prices. The three methods of GDP calculation only yield the same result if the same prices are used. However, prices may differ due to indirect taxes and subsidies, where indirect taxes are taxes on products and other taxes on production, and subsidies are subsidies on products and other subsidies on production. So there are three different prices. The first one is the market prices. That is the prices that are used when calculating GDP using expenditure method. The second one is the basic prices. That is the prices that are used when calculating GDP using value added method. And then the last one is the factor cost or factor income. That is the prices used when calculating GDP using the income method. The GDP valuation at factor cost, basic prices, and market prices. You take the GDP at factor cost, you add other taxes on production, you subtract other subsidies on production, and then you get GDP at basic prices. And then you take the GDP at basic prices, you add taxes on products, you subtract subsidies on products, and then you get GDP at market prices. So this is the same thing that you do on the previous slide to get the different prices. GDP valuation at current prices and constant prices. Nominal GDP is the first measurement of GDP at current prices. That is, prices paid by consumers in that period. Nominal GDP is equivalent to GDP at current prices. During inflationary times, adjustments for price increases are required. This is done because it allows us to compare GDP, that is the actual production of goods, from one period to another without it being skewed by inflation. Real GDP is equals to GDP at constant prices. Measuring the value of economic activity, GDP, example of nominal and real GDP, where the base year is equals to 2007. So this is how you calculate nominal GDP versus real GDP. For nominal GDP, you take the quantity of cars times the price of that year divided by 1 million, and then you get the 120. For real GDP, you take the quantity of the cars times the price of the base year. So the base year is 2007, and then we'll use the price of this throughout. So we'll use 132,000 divided by 1 million. So this is the complete example. As you can see, for nominal GDP, we use the different prices of each year, but for real GDP, we use the same price of the base year. Nominal GDP and real GDP. In the base year, nominal GDP is equivalent to real GDP, but before the base year, nominal GDP is less than real GDP, and after the base year, nominal GDP is greater than real GDP. This graph shows the nominal and real GDP for South Africa, where the blue line is nominal GDP and the red line represents real GDP. On the vertical axis, you have your GDP in millions, and then on the horizontal axis, you have your years. So before the year 2000, real GDP was greater than nominal GDP, and in mid-2000, the two were equivalent. And then after that, nominal GDP became greater than real GDP. Economic growth. Economic growth is defined as the growth rate of real GDP in an economy. It is concerned with the increase in production and not in prices. How to calculate a growth rate? Real growth rate for 2019 is equivalent to the GDP of 2019 minus the GDP of 2018 divided by the GDP of 2018 times 100 for percentage. So in general, growth rate is equivalent to the GDP in the current year minus the GDP of the previous year divided by the GDP of the previous year times 100. GDP at current and constant prices, annual growth in GDP since 2010. So this represents the GDP at current prices, and then this is the GDP at constant prices since the year 2010 until 2017. So as you can see, over the years, the GDP at current prices has been greater than the GDP at nominal prices, with the exception of 2010. And then this is the nominal annual growth rate, and then the real annual growth rate. Even here, the nominal annual growth rate has been greater than the real annual growth rate over the years. Growth in real GDP on quarter basis. So this is from 2017 until 2019. So in 2017, only in the first quarter, the growth in real GDP was negative. And then in 2018, in both the first and the second quarter, the growth in real GDP was negative, and then in the two last quarters, it was positive. However, in 2019, it was only positive for the second quarter. So this following slide still shows the growth in real GDP on quota basis. Gross national income. GDP is a geographical concept which reflects production on South African soil. Foreign-owned production taking place in South Africa is also included. However, GNI is a residential concept which reflects production of South African citizen or permanent citizens. So GNI is equivalent to GDP minus all the income that is earned in South Africa by foreign factors of production, plus all the income earned by South Africa's factors of production in the rest of the world. So because of the time, I have to end this video here and then continue with gross domestic expenditure on the following video. Thank you for your attention. See you on the next video.